Today's energy talk is called nuclear, the other clean energy. I think this is a very relevant topic, especially in today's day and age, where environmental considerations are very big importance, especially in the energy industry. Our speaker today is Matthew Dalzell. He is from the, it's very mouthful, Fedoruk Canadian Centre for Nuclear Innovation. And he's very well educated. He's actually an alumni of the U of S. He has a bachelor's in education from the U of S, a bachelor's in science, and a master's in geoscience. Is that right? I creeped in on LinkedIn earlier, so I knew all that. But yeah, please give me a hand welcoming up to the stage.
Thank you. It is great to be here, and I'm really glad to have this opportunity to talk to you about. First, can anyone hear me? Is it annoyingly loud? Okay, good. So, Stefan sent me an email and said, "Can you do something about nuclear?" And it's, sustainability. And I said, well, there's been a bit of a theme that we've been thinking about the Fedoruk Center, and we're not the only ones. But when I was a kid growing up, there was a commercial by pork producers trying to get people to eat pork, and it was talking about pork as being healthy, because most people didn't think it was, and it was, well, it's versus chicken, and they said, well, actually, pork is the other white meat, so everyone should eat it. And guess what? Pork sales are going through the roof. So that got us to think about nuclear, and it's not a lot of people think about it as being a low emission source of electricity, of energy in general, not just electricity. I'll talk about that a little more later. So that came up with the idea of let's talk about nuclear as being the other clean energy. I'm going to start by not talking about energy. I'm going to talk about people, because people, of course, are users of energy and users of resources. And this picture, I think, sums up part of the situation you're having to deal with. Did everyone see that? Or should I try to hit the button? This way you can see this. But you can see here, population is a concern. Population growth is a concern. This is an example. This is from the United Nations, and this shows population growth and what we're expecting in 2050. So what you can see is the developed countries are fairly stable. We've been stable about the last 100 years. We're going to be essentially stable since the baby booms, about 100 years. Then we have less developed countries and then the least developed countries. And the thing you'll notice is we're looking at lots of issues with climate change and energy consumption. Most of the resources up until very recently have been by these people, and that's beginning to change. So how many people we have here? We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Can I have that group of people stand up? Okay. About 1 in 6 people on the planet have no access to electricity. None at all. You hear people talk about Wi-Fi being a right? These people don't even have electricity. Not a light bulb, not a fridge, nothing. Okay? The rest of that group stand up. That's being a little much, but another 2.7 billion people don't have access to clean energy sources. And when I say that, what are they doing? They're burning biomass. They have charcoal, they're burning dung, they're burning wood. And of course, burning the wood can also add to deforestation in places like sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, it's a time. So energy is a very big issue. So those people I'm talking about are these people here. Okay? But at the same time, world energy consumption is going up. But if you notice what's happening, the blue line is OECD. That's OECD countries. You can call those the developed world. And the red are non-OECD countries. Some of whom are developed, but a lot of them are not. And you can see the per capita energy use. So the developed world uses a lot of energy. in terms of, and the developing world doesn't up until 2010. That line is going up, and if you can see here, you can look at world energy consumption is increasing a fair amount. If you notice, the two largest chunks here that we're dealing with, or the three, this purple, this yellow, and this red, are fossil fuels. What's the fastest growing fuel source, primary source of energy? Coal. Okay. And not just in the developing world, but in the developed world. China, or Japan, in their new long-term energy strategy, are looking at something like 40 coal-fired power plants. Okay. But more than the sources of energy, as I said, you can look at these people who don't have any energy or not reliable sources of energy. And we talk about that as being energy poverty. And energy poverty is really obvious if you look at the Earth at night. You can see, again, those blue countries in the OECD are lit up. And then these large areas where they're not. And I want to show you one striking one. This is Japan. This is South Korea. That black area is North Korea. Except for that little dot, which is Pyongyang. So you can see, even on the Korean Peninsula, a very stark difference between an area that's a developed country with lots of energy and a country that is energy poor. And the differences in quality of life that come from that. So these are just three examples. Working at night, so lighting, heating and cooking, and doing the washing. This is in the developed world, in the developing world. This is what they want, right? Light so we can continue to work without having to burn kerosene. Electric heat, or at least gas ranges so we cook. One thing I did mention is that 2.5 billion people who don't have access to, who have to burn biomass, about 4 million of them a year die from illnesses attributable to respiratory disease from breathing particulate matter. So breathing in smoke. And I don't know, anyone know Hans Rosling? Heard of Hans Rosling? He actually died a couple weeks ago. He was a Swedish physician and an economist. And go to TED or YouTube and look up, Google magic washing machine. Because in it, I actually had a chance to see him in person. He maintains that the greatest single piece of technology that's aided world development is the washing machine. Anyone want to guess why?
Time.
It's time. It gives time for people to do things, right? So instead of having to spend hours and hours, and it's not just necessarily washing against rocks in a river, it can also be using scrub boards and rollers. It allows people to have time, and particularly half of the population to have more time. You notice in the picture here, I'm saying that thanks to technology, even guys can do laundry. Right? But it really does. It really has. So what we're talking about here is quality of life. Okay? We're talking about opportunity. We're talking about actually physical health. And all these are things that having energy that's freely available or is readily available and it is predictable and is stable is so important. Of course, as you notice, while world energy consumption is going up, what else is going up? And actually pretty much the shapes of the curves are actually pretty closely matched if you just eyeball it. I wouldn't do a regression or anything. But you can see that as our energy demands are going up, so of course are the millions of tons of carbon and carbon equivalents, greenhouse gases being released in the air. And as a result, the Earth is warming. So what do we do about it? Probably know who this guy is. This is another TED Talk. Actually, I don't think it's a TED Talk. It's a talk he gave on his own website, because of course when you're Bill Gates, you can do that. People watch it. he, I think, framed the problem we have to deal with very succinctly. And essentially that total greenhouse gas emissions is a product of all these things. It's increasing population. It's access to services that require energy. It's the energy itself. And it's what he calls carbon waste. So it's the carbon dioxide and the other greenhouse gases that are emitted from doing that. And if you want to stop, if you want to get to zero emissions, mass says one of these factors has to become a zero. Now, maybe we won't need to go to zero emissions, but if that was a goal, it just shows you the magnitude of the problem here. So we'd have to either, even if we want to half that, we have to do some serious work on one of those numbers. Population is going to go up, right? Access to services, well, as I sort of tried to demonstrate, we need to get people more access to services, not less. Energy. Again, these are two closely coupled things. You can't really decouple that from having access to those services. We can do some things with conservation and higher efficiency. But again, we're looking at sheer volume of increases in people. Okay, we're talking 3 billion people, raising them out of poverty and giving them essentially lifestyles that we have in Canada. But then you have carbon waste, which is sources, basically your energy sources that you're using, the ones that we don't want to emit. So here's our options. This is from the IPCC. And if you notice, what do we have as our options? Well, we have coal. We've got natural gas, which is only half as bad as coal. That's like saying I've gone from smoking 2 packs a day to 1 pack a day. Then we, of course, have the renewables, hydro, wind, nuclear, wind offshore and onshore, coal, carbon capture, and tidal. Now, I put those in blue because they're experimental. They've not been fully measured and demonstrated because there's no grid scale application of them yet. But if you notice where nuclear sits, it's actually in between wind, between offshore wind and onshore wind. People will say, yeah, what about mining? Right? Mining is the dirty end of the stick when it comes to it. Well, it actually turns out it's actually not that bad. At least if you use Canadian uranium. Of course, Canadian uranium ore is very, very rich. This is a study actually the Fedoruk Center supported by Gordon Sparks, who's in the College of Engineering, and his student Dave Parker at Cam McNaughton works with Golder Associates. And what they found was they did a life cycle analysis of uranium mining in Saskatchewan, mining and milling. And they looked at everything. They looked at the cost of carbon intensity, or the cost of the carbon for the metal and the concrete that went into building the mine. They looked at the light bills for corporate headquarters in Saskatoon. They looked at the cost, the carbon emissions from flying workers in and out. Very, very exhaustive work. And so what they've shown is, in terms of life cycle emissions, in terms of grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour produced by that uranium, we're about 1. That's pretty good. I love this chart. People look at it, oh my God, why do you put that on the screen? It says a lot. This is from the University of Calgary. They've actually done one, I think, now it goes up to 2016. This one goes to 2014. But what it shows you in one picture is what energy looks like in Canada. Everything from primary sources all the way through the gates where we make use of it, some that are exported, and then the uses, all the different uses of it and the useful energy. This tells, to me, that this really summarizes, there's a lot of things you can take away from this. First of all, thermodynamics. This is an elegant illustration of thermodynamics, right? You can't get something for nothing, right? Energy, you can't create energy, you can't destroy it, you can only change its state. So we're going from primary production through these transition gates and then on to different things. And the other thing, of course, is we're looking at, there's always losses to the system. Anytime you go through one of these gates, Second law of thermodynamics. You lose useful energy from the system. You increase disorder. So all of these things start coming into play. And it shows you a couple other things too. In terms of exports, this is uranium. This arrow is the same width as this bar. You can see that Canada exports more energy as uranium than it does as oil, and basically half of the natural gas that we export combined, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. Another thing it shows you is, we're going to talk quite a bit about electricity. Of course, in the conversation on clean energy, a lot of it has to do with electricity. But as we'll discuss, which you can also see here is a bit of a foreshadow, there's a lot of other things involved besides electricity when we're looking at energy and the ways we use energy. So this is electricity. So we'll talk about electricity right now. So this is electricity in Canada as of 2015. And if you look at it as a country, we're actually already pretty clean. Okay, 63% of our energy or electricity comes from hydro. 16 from nuclear, 15 from coal, gas is 4, wind 2, solar is 0.05, and diesel is 0.2. That diesel is pretty much confined to the north. Now, if you look at Saskatchewan, I was at 15%, that becomes more closer to like 50% for Saskatchewan. And same goes for Alberta. There's some hydro, some natural gas. But you can definitely see globally, when we had the Three Amigos Summit here in I think it was last June, Justin Trudeau had this commitment how we're going to have 85% green energy. We're already there. We're almost there. It's the US and Mexico and other places that are. This is an example. I'm using Ontario as an example here, because you can see Ontario is the first jurisdiction in the developed world that burns coal to no longer burn coal. And they did it for 2 reasons. One, they have lots of hydro. They got Niagara Falls. But then they also increased the nuclear fleet. So nuclear now provide, and they added wind. They added some wind. So wind went from 2% to 6%. Solar went from being other to a little less than 1%. It's a little bit of biofuel. There's actually an app you can look at, and it actually you can see in real time where Ontario is getting its energy from. Hydro, they increased a bit too, but it is nuclear in Ontario that allowed them to really get off coal. But again, as I said, we're dealing with more than electricity. This wedge is electricity in terms of the energy we use in Canada. There's a whole bunch of other stuff. And this is yet to be really effectively decarbonized. So we're already doing pretty good on the electricity front. Definitely other places in the world can and do need to do some work with electricity. The other challenge is if we're going to start working in these other areas like transportation, one of the best ways to do it is to start a good pathway to decarbonization is to start looking at electrification. Electrify as much stuff as we can. So to that, we need clean sources of electricity. You buy an electric car and use it in Saskatchewan at the moment, your carbon footprint is actually higher than if you drive a modern, up-to-date car, because you have a coal-fired electric car. This is where some of the greenhouse gases come from. So we have transport. Transport in the oil and gas sector are big ones. Agriculture is big. Buildings are big. So you can see there are more things in play here than just electricity. And so much of the conversation about clean energy is focused just on electricity. There's a lot more to it than that. And so I'm not here to sell one thing or the other. I'm just simply to say, when we have these conversations, we have to broaden what we're talking about. First of all, we have to broaden what we talk about energy. You're talking about electricity, or you're talking about actual energy, all the different forms of energy that are used to run our society. And then also, are you just talking about Canada? Are you talking about the planet? So those are sort of two of the messages I want to leave with you. So let's talk about nuclear, because I think that's why you want to be here. So very quickly, I'll do what I call sort of nuclear 101. Nuclear right now is, of course, produced by, it's still a thermal source of power generation. Okay? It's just, instead of burning something, we're using fission. So instead of combusting coal or wood or oil or natural gas, we're using fission. So we're using uranium and the heat produced by fission to heat a coolant that then creates steam that drives a turbine. And inside of a reactor is a chain reaction going on. And every nuclear reactor is trying to do does three things. It sustains, contains, and controls a chain reaction. Okay? A nuclear reactor can't blow up. It's not a bomb. The way what we have to do, there's a number of systems in place to basically sustain the reaction. In fact, a lot of the time, it's actually sustaining that nuclear reaction, not just controlling it. So for that, to do that, we need a moderator. And the moderator is something that slows down the neutrons that are flying off as fission occurs. You actually have to slow down the neutrons so they can actually make contact with another nucleus and cause fission. So in the case of a CANDU reactor in Canada, we use water as the moderator. And actually, most reactors use water as the moderator for neutrons. And then you also have some kind of neutron absorbing material for your control. So it's all about neutrons. It's called neutron budget or neutron economy. It's all about getting neutrons out of atoms, hitting other atoms, causing those to undergo fission, to split, let up more neutrons, and on and on and on and on. What do you need? If you want to build a nuclear reactor, this is what you need. You need a fuel. So it needs to be fissile. It has to be something, a big, heavy nucleus that can be split apart readily. That includes uranium-235 and plutonium. Or you need something that's called fertile. And this is an atom, an element, that won't undergo fission itself, but you can do stuff to it to basically transmute it into something that will undergo fission. So that's thorium. So thorium is not a fissile material, it's a fertile material. And you actually, so there is work going on, we can talk more about thorium later if you're interested. Moderator, obviously, as I mentioned, that can be water, that can be heavy water, or it can be graphite. You need some kind of neutron absorbing material, and you need some kind of coolant to get the heat out of the core, so you can do something with it. And of course, you need a pot to put it all in. Common reactor types. Okay, pressurized water reactor. This is what most reactors are. Built by the Americans originally. Put in submarines. They use light water as the moderator coolant. They use enriched uranium. Okay, and depending on the reactor design, they can be anywhere from about 12% all the way up to 90% uranium-235. Again, the most common plant. And of course, there's CANDU. Developed in Canada in the 1940s and 50s. Been used now in Canada and around the world for 60 years. Heavy water, what makes it different, of course, is that the do isn't just because the pundits were being, not just marketing, it's because it's deuterium. So we use heavy water as the moderator and the coolant. And because we're using heavy water, which actually has extra neutrons in it that you can bounce around as well, we can use natural uranium. So there isn't any enrichment that's required. But because of that, your fuel burnup is actually faster than if you're using enriched uranium. So you have to refuel it more frequently. Now with a pressurized water reactor, refueling means you take it offline, you turn it off, you pull out the fuel, you put new fuel in. In the case of a CANDU, that's something quite clever, is they actually figured out how to fuel it online. So the reactor's running, And they actually have a machine that takes bundles and slides them into the fuel tubes, into the channels, and actually then the spent fuel gets pushed up the back end, then it is dealt with. Kind of pretty clever. Most reactors that are being built now and have been built, say, the last 30 years, there's been a tendency to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Okay? Because what that does is it drives the cost down of the electricity you're going to produce. That's the model that was used. So nuclear reactors got bigger and bigger and bigger because they could. However, that's caused some issues. And so bigger isn't always better. So we've gone from essentially, look at most reactor projects now, we're talking about gigawatt, okay, power. That has limitations. It has limitations in terms of cost. It also has where you can put them. For example, Saskatchewan, our grid is what, about 3,700 megawatts, so we're at 3.7 gigawatts. You can't put a gigawatt of power in one place on a grid that size. You're going to cause instabilities. Each reactor up until now has been effectively custom built. Even though you have a class of reactors, every time they build them in big changes. They do added things, lessons learned about safety, real or imagined, right? They do a lot of work around those things. But what happens then as a result is overruns and delays, which of course is what most critics, and rightfully so, critics of the nuclear industry talk about the overruns and the cost overruns and the delays for getting these things built. But as I mentioned, you need a sophisticated power grid. And of course, the last bullet here is what's currently hurting nuclear in the US, for example. Significant capital investment. There's a significant capital investment. Okay. But you'll see a return on investment on it because your reactor will last for about 40 to 60 years. But not a lot of capitalists, investors, are willing to wait for 60 years for the return on investment. So this is a challenge for the nuclear industry. So what can we do? This is where small modular reactors come into play. So when we say small, they're 300 megawatts electric or less. And the idea is that they're transportable, either the whole core or these significant modules of them. You can fabricate them in a factory, just like building an airplane. You take it to where you need it. So you're not dealing with custom stick-built construction. And they're scalable. Some reactor models themselves, they say you can actually scale the output. The other thing about nuclear is nuclear likes to run all the time. So if you have a gigawatt plant, you don't want to dump steam if you install it because it's a waste. It's a waste. But the idea is with smaller reactors, you could do that. As mentioned, the modular. The idea for this is that it would be less expensive to produce because you don't just build one at a time every 20 years. You'll build 10 of them at once, or 20 of them at once. Think of like how Airbus or Boeing builds airplanes. This is what we're talking about now. And the reactor. The reactor is actually smaller, so there is less fissile material present, right? Which means less waste, less proliferation risk, easier to control, easier to handle, right? And there's a lot of different designs looking at. There are some that are like this one from NuScale. It's basically a submarine reactor. It's a pressurized water reactor. Or looking at boiling water reactors, again, very common things that already exist, just made smaller. But then there's a lot of other unconventional ideas, like molten salt reactors, which could use uranium or thorium, spallation-driven, which I can talk about a little bit, and even looking at fusion. That's down the road, but I classify a fusion reactor. Now, my friends at General Fusion would say, what? But I count them as a small modular reactor. The big thing about these is most of them are not new ideas. So as I mentioned, we're looking at innovation for these pressurized water reactors, small pressurized water reactors. Well, we've had them on submarines since 1954. Not new. Molten salt reactors, where the fuel is actually a liquid. It's not a solid. It's actually the uranium and the other fissile things you're using are actually dissolved in the salt. And And this was originally pioneered in Oak Ridge National Laboratory in the States for a nuclear-powered jet engine. Flew in the 1950s. No, when I say flew, it was on the plane. It actually wasn't running the engines, but it was powering. The idea at the time was that the U.S. Strategic Bomber Command thought the best way to keep a nuclear deterrent on station 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, was we have planes. The problem with planes is they have to land. You have to put gas in. So well, we'll just build a plane, you don't have to refuel. Which worked. Sounded like a good idea until someone said, well, what about the crew? And they went, oh. At which point Admiral Richtover from the Navy said, tell you what, we can do it. We don't have to worry about landing the crew. Then there's some other interesting ideas, and this is a triso fuel pellet. And the interesting thing about a triso fuel pellet is it's actually on the next slide, is this. It's actually a little ball, about the size of a small marble, and it's a polycarbide on the outside, and your fuel, your uranium oxide, for example, is inside this kernel. The clever thing about this is the melting point of the carbide is about 150 degrees higher than the melting point of the uranium. So these can be, so you can't melt the fuel down. These are what's used in what's called a pebble bed reactor, and there's a couple that have been designed as research reactors. But the idea is we could actually use these in regular use, mostly in gas-cooled reactors. The other thing we can look at is what we call passive cooling. So the issue is, of course, what about pumps? We have to, most reactors nowadays have pumps that circulate the cooling water around. So you need electricity to do that. Doing this, we can actually use convection. A smaller reactor, you can use convection to actually cool it. You can look at things like negative temperature power coefficient. So if the reactor gets too hot, or so it's too much power, or if the reactor gets too hot, the power curve drops, and you actually go into a safe mode. Molten salt reactors are clever because they can make use of gravity. So what the idea for a molten salt reactor, how it works is you have a plug right here that you keep cold. So you need a refrigerator plant to keep this plug cold under the reactor. So if you lose power, the plug melts. And then gravity takes your fuel and it moves into dump tanks. If you divide your fuel up enough into enough separate dump tanks, it's no longer critical mass. Reaction stops. You can also look at external reaction drivers. This is the spallation one. We're basically using a particle accelerator just to create your neutron source to get your reaction going. You turn that off, the reaction sputters. And of course, in fusion, it involves both magnetic containment, but also an actual fuel injector. You actually inject plasma. You turn the plasma injection system off. You turn off your fuel. You turn off your reaction. Number of benefits that we've seen in our research for what this could mean for Canada if we decided as a country to start looking at small modular reactors. Big thing is, of course, greenhouse gas avoidance. Not just in Canada, but if this technology is exported, because it can be used in smaller grids, it can be used abroad as well. And again, help dealing with those issues of sustainable, accessible energy in other places, which also helps sustainable development. The idea, obviously, for national benefit from creating a new nuclear industry in Canada. The UK government says that the SMR market potentially is between $400 and $650 billion. So if someone cracks this nut, it could be quite lucrative. For Canada, it looks at sustainable natural resource development. Ontario is looking at SMRs to help develop the Ring of Fire, which is a big mineral play in northern Ontario. Challenge is there's any source of power nearby, and it's prohibitively expensive. They're looking at in terms of both cost and also in terms of carbon intensity to start building diesel generator plants. So they're actually looking seriously at the idea, and they commissioned a study from HATS that was published last summer, looking at the potential for small reactors. The other is the idea is looking at it for the north. Getting the north off of diesel fuel. Big challenge again is access to energy. Not just electricity, but heat. You could look at doing things like district heating. You could look at things like greenhouses, where you basically have a nuclear heat source, and then you're supplying not just electricity, but heat for industry, so for process heat, for things like smelting, for desalination, but also for doing things like heating greenhouses. The UK is also very interested in looking at SMRs for district heating. What's it mean for us? Well, COP21, obviously a lot of ambitious things made, commitments made to meet what they call the 2-degree scenario, which is to try to curve our carbon emissions to keep the warming of the planet to 2 degrees, and actually want to say 1.5 degrees. That brought a number of commitments, mission innovation being the big one. And this is not only governments, but also industry. So there's Bill Gates between Barack Obama and Justin Trudeau. And the commercial wing, or the business groups involved in mission innovation, called themselves Breakthrough Energy Coalition. And they include people like Bill Gates, and Jeff Bezos, and Mark Zuckerberg, and I want to say Jack Ma. He runs Alibaba in China. So they're putting their own money on the table. Bill Gates is putting up money. He's invested in a small reactor company called TerraPower. Part of the commitments of COP21 is that we agreed to is that we would publish a strategy to say how are we going to deal with our energy emissions by 2050. And this document came out in December. You can get it online. It's a good read. It's a mid-century long. It is a treaty title, because the title is actually the COP21 treaty, which is Canada's mid-century long-term low greenhouse gas development strategy. Okay, it's a legalese title. But what it looks at is a number of different potential roles. And if you notice, part of the strategy, this is up to 2050, is the idea. This is where we are right now. Oh.
Bottom button.
There we go. Saved it. This is where we are right now. Lots of hydro, some nuclear, some other things. Then there's some various, you can't really see them, but a number of different scenarios. And so if we want to grow our electricity grid, it's a number of different options that are being considered. The high ambition option, nuclear still is in there, but again, the emphasis on here is on renewables. It's ambitious because they're looking at things, there's a lot of things we need to, there's a lot of breakthroughs that are still required, energy storage being one, to do this. But then if you look at a number of these other ideas, we're actually looking at growing nuclear as an option for the country. None of these have been prescribed saying we're going to follow that one, but it's part of the conversation. And to meet these, we will actually have to substantially increase the nuclear fleet in the country, not just in Ontario, but potentially in other places as well. Currently, there's 2 nuclear provinces, Ontario and New Brunswick. Another thing about mission innovation is that it was the governments all signed on to commit more money to science and technology research. So Canada is looking to say by 2020 we'll have about $750 million in clean energy, clean tech research. That includes nuclear. Canada is one of the only countries who specifically said, yeah, that includes nuclear too. So the government, as policy, says that nuclear is a clean technology. A lot of other countries did. I mean, about 20 signatories, I think maybe 5 said, yeah, nuclear's in there too. But Canada's one of the countries that did say that. Big question, anyone talks about nuclear, how am I doing for time? Okay, what about the waste? And the first thing I want to say, that second law of thermodynamics, there's always waste, right? There's always something lost in the system that you can't do anything about. Be it old solar panels, or old windmill components, or exhaust from your gas plant, or spent fuel. There's the amount of radioactive waste in Canada as of 2013. These numbers look staggering, but I think they're also remarkable. And the reason why I say they're remarkable is because we actually know what these numbers are. Ask the coal industry. They don't have a clue. Ask the gas industry. They don't know. Right? The nuclear knows. Okay? They actually look at this. And if you also look at most of these things, low-level waste, about 90% is low-level waste. That's things like mops, coveralls, things that you actually put in a room and they decay, and the level radioactivity will decrease over time. This includes medical waste, okay, from nuclear medicine procedures. And there's your intermediate level waste, which are like reactor components that become radioactive over time. And then there's 10,000 cubic meters of high level waste, and that's the spent fuel. And those are, well, it says about 2.6 million fuel bundles, which sounds, again, like a staggering amount. Again, I think it's amazing we know there's 2.6 million fuel bundles. Fuel bundles about that big. Wish I had one, but it's hard to get them nowadays. But maybe not a full one, an empty one, just a class, I do know a guy who took one on a speaking tour, had it in his bag, and then airline security was really quite curious what he had there. Oh, that's my nuclear fuel bundle. When you regain consciousness, no. And then, of course, uranium mining waste and rock tails. But again, any extractive industry, do they know these numbers? What does 2.6 million fuel bundles look like? Well, this number is from the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. If you took 7 NHL hockey rinks and you stacked all those bundles from the ice, they reached the boards in 7 hockey rinks. Gives a little bit of context. And also over time, of course, the thing about radioactive waste is it doesn't stay radioactive forever. Okay? Even toxicity changes or decreases over time. So that's what those examples are. Most of the stuff you're really worried about in terms of extremely radioactive byproducts are gone in about 10 years. So they actually are gone before fuel even goes into what we call dry storage. It's when it's sitting in the cooling ponds inside the power plant. And it goes down, continues to go down over time. And there is a plan to deal with it. So right now, you've got in a reactor, there's the refueling arm, which is really cool. It pushes them out the back end of this is the reactor itself, out the back end, goes into a cooling pond. It sits there for about 10 years, as I said, to cool off. And that's when you lose a lot of the really high level nasty fizzles that you really don't want to deal with. Then they go into what's called dry storage. And all the nuclear spent fuel that we've manufactured in the last 60 years are sitting on the plant sites. Some have been moved to Chalk River. They're from the old AECL labs. But they're in these dry casks. And that's where they sit. No one has ever been harmed by nuclear waste in Canada. It just sits there. The plan is to take these fuel bundles, put them in capsules, seal them in bentonite inside a waste management facility, a deep geologic repository. This is the plan for the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. It's been around since the 1980s. It's being developed as we go. And the idea is that it's currently being involved with a lot of engagement in a process they call adaptive phase management. So they're looking, first of all, for a willing host community. So this isn't the government saying, we're going to put it there. This is the community saying, that we'll host that. We'll look after that. And that's where where we're at right now. I think there's about 6 communities right now in the process of learning about this, and eventually, hopefully, they'll come to the point where they'll say, yeah, we're with that. There were two communities in Saskatchewan that were in consideration initially. In terms of the geology, isn't right. Geology in Saskatchewan, northern Saskatchewan, is great for digging up uranium. They're not putting it back in there. Lastly, we can look at fusion, which Canada has not been involved in. There are 2 active research sites for fusion research. One is about 200 yards that way. And this is actually the Storm Tokamak on campus. And then there's General Fusion in Burnaby, BC. And so we're the Fedoruk Center, U of S, University of Alberta, General Fusion, University of Ontario Institute of Technology, and a couple small companies are trying to help kickstart the fusion research strategy in Canada again. And the idea is that we'd be in the position that by 2030 we could play a role in exciting and setting up a commercial nuclear fusion plant. And ultimately, as I said, sustainability is what we're really here to do. Okay, it's not picking a particular technology. At the end of the day, it's about sustainability. And sustainability is a balancing act between whether the environmental impacts of your technology that you want to look at using, what the impact on the economy is, both in your country but in also developing countries. We're trying to help lift out of poverty. The balance between safety and health and well-being, the social acceptance. Those are all places that all forms of energy we want to look at going forward need to address. And I think nuclear power probably has a role to play there. That's it.
So if anyone has any questions, he said he was happy to answer them. So.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on the PR battle that nuclear faces? Because there's been, 3 major incidents for nuclear power: Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, Fukushima. And if you look at those incidents and the number of people that died and the land that they lost, and you weigh it against something like fossil fuel, it's a pittance, it's nothing. But you have something like Fukushima happen, and the entire country of Japan suddenly shuts down all its reactors as a reaction to that. So what has to change moving forward to that change?
Not just Japan, but Germany.
Yeah.
That is something we're actually actively involved in looking at the Fedoruk Center with some other research. The industry is as well. I think the biggest change that needs to come is how the nuclear industry and interacts with people. So it's very much a very centralized, top-down, trust us. Right? I think it has to be more of a conversation with people. I think it is to bring those other pieces of information out. So, for example, Fukushima. No one has died from radiation to Fukushima. No one. 16,000 people died because of a big earthquake and a big tsunami. 2 workers were killed at the plant, but again, big earthquake and big tsunami. There have been 5 cases of cancer reported in workers. Was that due to radiation or something else? We don't know. But we're going to say, yep, okay, 5. Cancer. About 1,600 people have died as a result of the evacuation. And that is because not of radiation, it's the fear of radiation. So I think that's one of the big things. We have to have a conversation about what radiation is. We have to have a conversation about pros and cons. And about risk. And the nuclear industry has to do a better job, I think, of that. I think what's happened in the past is you don't hear about anything about nuclear until something goes wrong. Right? And there's been some debate, for example, I know from some people in this, talking about is that we need to actually, and this actually has met with some interesting comments. We need to stop, the nuclear industry needs to stop talking about safety all the time. Which when you think about it, and trust me, the president of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission disagrees. Because I was in the room and he stood up and said, I disagree. And if you've ever met Michael Benjamin, he says, I disagree. That's me being euphemistic. He made it very clear that he disagreed. But that's one thing, right? No one talks about coal being safe or natural gas being safe. But nuclear is extremely safe. And actually, that's been a point of pride. But maybe it's something we've been pushing too hard, right? Maybe it's comes down to they kind of always talk about safety. I wonder why? Because it's not safe. So, does that answer your question? I'm not saying we stop talking about safety. So no one tell Michael Binder that I said we should stop talking about safety, because it is important. Yeah.
No, maybe you mentioned during the talk that I just completely glazed over.
Because my talk was too long.
Oh no. No, it was really good. But what if you could talk to the cost per megawatt hour for nuclear versus, let's say, natural gas?
I can, actually. This is where I have those extra slides.
It's right up front by the pencil.
Right up at the clicker. There we go. There. Cost. This is real numbers from Ontario from 2016. This is cost per cents per kilowatt hour. So you can do the math. But this is where it comes in. So hydro is so basically hydro is cheapest. Nuclear is second cheapest in Ontario in terms of revenues. And generally, that's what I've seen is that nuclear ends up being in this area. Why is that? It's because, yes, to build it, it's a lot of money up front. But once they're built and running, they don't actually cost much.
Well, yeah,
Kind of like hydro, right? You build a big dam, it's really expensive, and then once it's running, the difference with hydro is it's gravity, right? The fuel, your fuel source is free because it's just water falling down a hill. Yeah.
With solar, especially with Ontario, is that number a little affected by the policies of the government and their kind of bad practice with how they dealt with that?
I'm not an expert on the Ontario stuff, but it's more. I think it's actually it's part of the subsidy process that's gone into it. So it's actually distorted the market. Does that mean solar would be less expensive without the feed-in tariffs? I'd say no, but I'm not an energy economist. I would think that if solar was inexpensive, we would need a feed-in tariff. That's just me, because I'm not an energy economist.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there was like if that solar price was, because I know Ontario did have like big.
They had the feed-in
there was
tariff.
a lot of
issues,
backlash over their policies from the public.
Mhm.
I was just wondering if that was a typical price range for other provinces as well.
Can't say in other provinces, but things I've looked at in terms of cost, solar is the most expensive, and then it goes down from there. Then of course you're dealing with fuel sources as well, price of fuel. Natural gas is actually low. That's because the global natural gas market is extremely depressed at the moment because there's so much gas on the market. The market's flooded. Yeah.
I had a write-in question, and he was particularly interested in your views on how nuclear is sustainable. Like, in what sense is nuclear sustainable?
Okay. Actually, that's a good question. So when we talk about sustainability, to me that is a balance of a number of different things. It's how long we can run something without depleting the environment, and basically it's how long you can stand to run something before either you deplete the environment, you wreck your economy, you don't have opportunities, or it's impacting your health, for example. And nuclear is sustainable in those regards because it is economical. It is, in terms of carbon emissions, low. So from the environmental side, and again with the waste reduction and things like that, there are mechanisms in place that are being looked at and are being addressed. So in all those areas, I'd say it is sustainable. It's more sustainable than coal because of a whole bunch of reasons. Okay, you can dig it up, burn it, you're causing an impact on the environment. You're a contributor to both direct death from when you're producing the coal and smog and things like that. So in those regards, it's not. I have another talk I did, we're not gonna do it today. About things being clean and green and sustainable. Clean and green are marketing terms. What's clean? If it's in terms of doesn't emit a whole bunch of carbon in the atmosphere, okay, that's our definition of clean, and that nuclear counts in that. Green's a marketing term, right? Natural gas brands itself as green. It's the second dirtiest source in terms of carbon emissions after coal. But they've been able to brand themselves successfully as green, which is an interesting thing back to your comment about nuclear. Natural gas industry has been able to brand itself as green. What about the nuclear industry? So that's where I'd see it coming in terms of sustainability. It meets the sustainable test. Yeah. Oh, yes.
So there's obviously tons of advantages. But Canada hasn't built a nuclear power plant in 30 years,
Mm-hmm.
and they're rapidly being decommissioned. And that would like
Well,
gonna-
refurbishing,
oh,
not decommissioning.
well,
The decommissioning Pickering eventually, but
Yeah.
they're refurbishing it right now.
okay. But what do you have to say with like facilities like Chalk River being kind of less going on there than they have been in the past, and the general avoidance of this right now? Is that just the bad reputation it has?
I think politics does definitely come into play. It would certainly be nice if the federal government, they've acknowledged nuclear as part of their energy strategy. It's in their documents, but you don't hear Justin Trudeau talking about it. Right? That would do a lot, I think, in that regard. In terms of Chalk River and the research infrastructure, it's being turned over. In fact, Chalk River is looking at rebranding itself as the place that you want to build and test your small modular reactor. Come to Chalk River. It's a great big site. They have lots of technology, lots of experts, and a license, huge license site, which you can't find anywhere else in Canada. So I think we're definitely at a point where we're at a turning point. But I think there's a good opportunity there in terms of building something, having not built something in a while. In terms of the expertise in building the CANDU reactors, we still have that. And in fact, we're building CANDU reactors other places, just not here right now. Yes?
So with like the potential emergence of these small modular reactors, not only in Canada, but potentially across the globe,
Mm-hmm.
what kind of length of time would it have to be kind of before Canada would have to switch from a net exporter to a net importer of physical material?
I don't think ever. We have enough uranium in northern Saskatchewan to keep the planet going quite nicely. Saskatchewan is the second largest producer of uranium on the planet. We have more uranium in our mine tailings than some active mines have in their source of it. So I think we're okay in that regard. I don't know the exact numbers, but it's
I don't
long
know.
enough that by then we'll have fusion and we won't need to worry about it.
And we do have the highest grade.
Yep.
We have fairly poor amount of reserves, like in terms of
Mhm.
global, when compared to somebody like Russia or
Well, Kazakhstan
Yeah.
has a lot,
Yeah.
and they still have a lot. And in fact, they're now decided not to dig it up quite so fast. But I don't know the exact time, what point in time. There's also people talking about extracting uranium from seawater, which, again, pushes the time frames several hundred years down the road. Yeah.
So do you see a modular reactor like this going up somewhere like Saskatchewan, or do you think this is going to pop up in Ontario since they already have the infrastructure there to deal with the topic?
Really good question. I think it depends on what the reactor is. If it's the first of kind demonstrator, it would be in Ontario, I think. Simply because that's where Chalk River is, and that's where the site is, if you licensed. SAS Power, if you go to the website and look, they're still looking at nuclear as an option for the future. Would it be one of the very first ones? That I don't know. I mean, partly it's how fast the technology gets here. And it's coming. I mean, there are some of the vendor design reviews that came through Safety Commission. Basically, here's my design, what do you think, from the Safety Commission. There are 5 reactors not currently deployed right now, 5 reactor designs. China is building them right now. Russia is building one right now. Korea is building one right now. So I don't think the first small S, and of course the new scale S, they're also moving really quickly. So would the first SMR ever be in Canada? Probably not. I think they'll probably be in other places, but Canada has an opportunity to be part of it as well. And a 300 megawatt or 200 megawatt small modular reactor would replace a coal-fired plant really nicely. Yeah.
Have you seen any data that shows kind of a significant change in perception of nuclear as kind of the people who grew up under the Cold War have started to be replaced by newer generation?
That's a good question. In fact, if you look at some research that was done by the US in 2013, they looked at Saskatchewan attitudes. It's called the Saskatchewan Nuclear Attitude Survey. They did look at that, and they looked at the age cohorts. And definitely younger people are more inclined to be to consider nuclear than people in older cohorts. And I think definitely the Cold War is part of it. Certainly that didn't help nuclear's reputation. So particularly we look at the old guard environmental movement, which is anti-nuclear, is also pretty much commingled with the peace movement, the disarmament movement from that time. So I think they sort of have the same genesis. So I think that's part of where that comes from. But certainly when you look at the numbers from the Nuclear Attitudes Survey, there's a very large, cautiously supportive group in the center. And I think that you find in most places when we look at nuclear is you're going to have the 20% who are really for nuclear. It's a wonderful thing. You're going to have the 10-20% who think it's awful and hate it and never let you do it. It's a terrible thing to do. Then you have this large group of people in the middle, some of whom being towards being supportive and some who don't. But I think we know from the Nuclear Attitude Survey, and the nuclear industry had nothing to do with that. It was done by the Social Science Research Laboratory here at campus. The research they showed is that the majority of people in Saskatchewan are supportive of the concept of using nuclear. Do you have any last questions?
Yeah. You talked about some of the pebble bed reactors.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, what sort of limitations? Why is it only really in the research phase? Is it due to power outage or output? Sorry.
Good question. I really don't know. If I could hazard a guess, I would say it's because the nuclear industry is extremely conservative, and they know about fuel rods. It's the same way, they know about fuel rods, they know about solid uranium pellets, they know how to make that work, so that's what they do. And because we were dealing with these long-term projects, no one wanted to be too clever, I think, in what they do. And also I think some of the regulatory regimes were, again, not terribly supportive of trying something really outside of what had been there already. So that I think is part of the big reason why we haven't seen these. They've been around, again, just as research reactors. And I think that's a big barrier to why they didn't scale up, is because the industry didn't embrace them as a commercial option. I think that's just Dalzell's opinion. It's not fact.
Any last questions? Or? All right, well, I'd like to thank Matt for coming
Thank
out
you.
and talking to us.